On the other side of the Mediterranean, in southern France, the historic town of Montauban has an unusual connection with a group of travellers from another continent and another time. In the early 19th century, a group of Native Americans from the Osage nation were lured to France with the promise of wealth and fame. Abandoned by their sponsor and left destitute, they eventually found their way to Montauban, where they were given sanctuary by the people of the town, forging a connection that's still celebrated today. Chris Bockman has been tracing their story.
The beautiful town of Montauban is overshadowed by the city of Toulouse just 50 kilometers to the south, and yet it has one of the most beautiful squares anywhere in southern France, with mysterious arcades along all four corners to protect the residents against the beating heat. The town sits on a plateau and is regularly the hottest place in France over the summer. While visiting Montauban, I retreated to the nearest park, the Jardin des Plantes, and that's how I first learned of the town's unusual and unexpected link with the Osage Native Americans in Oklahoma. While strolling in the shade, I stumbled across a majestic stone monument in front of a lawn which reads, "You are now on Native American soil." This parcel of land was handed over to the Osage tribe by the town's mayor in July 1992 to commemorate 3 Native Americans who were abandoned here more than a century and a half ago. The plot of land is just 200 meters square, but I was intrigued. What was a native reservation doing here? I later discovered Montauban is twinned with the town of Pawhuska in Osage County in Oklahoma. But why? For that, I turned to Jean-Claude, a former biology teacher and amateur historian. It was his research that led to the people dedicating that small pocket of land to the Osage people. About 40 years ago, he had read in a history magazine, now out of print, about 6 so-called Redskins who had visited the royal court in Paris in the 1820s and ended up in extreme distress in Montauban. He discovered that in the 18th century, France was the colonial occupier of the U.S. state of Louisiana, which extended far beyond the state borders of today and included what's now Kansas and Oklahoma, lands where the Osage people lived. A shady French merchant navy officer saw a money-making opportunity back home whereby he could parade the Osage across France in a human circus. To get the Osage on board, he told them they would become famous and rich. Most of them didn't buy it, but 6 were convinced to make the trip, 3 men and 3 women, and travelled to France dressed in their traditional clothes. And sure enough, they attracted huge crowds on their arrival in the port city of Le Havre in 1827, and they were even received at the court of King Charles X. But soon afterwards, the navy officer who brought them to France was arrested and imprisoned for embezzlement, and the 6 Osage were left to fend for themselves. With no money and little understanding of the French language, they spent 2 years wandering around France, Belgium, and even Italy, close to starvation and in very poor health. The group split when 3 of them heard that a French priest from Louisiana who knew of the Osage was now Bishop of Montauban. They headed there barefoot to plead for help. And sure enough, the bishop persuaded the town's residents to come up with the money to send all 6 back home to Oklahoma. 4 of them made it, 2 died on the trip back. Every year, a ceremony is still held in the park to mark the event and further strengthen ties between the Osage and the people of Occitania, as this part of southwest France is called. In fact, over the years, more than 550 Osages have visited this region of France. One of them, a poet called Chelsea Terrien Hicks, told me she wanted to understand more about her mixed heritage, explaining that her middle name is French because of a tradition from the colonial era where French fur traders married the 3rd daughters of Osage families. Jean-Claude, the amateur historian who rediscovered the town's history, has now been to the United States to visit the Osage 12 times. The governor of Oklahoma has made him an honorary lieutenant governor of the state for his work building relations between the Occitan and the Osage people. It's really about what we have in common, he explained. The people of Occitania, like the Osage, have their own language and culture which have not always been tolerated. And that's why these cultural exchanges are so important.
Chris Bockman.
Radio 4.